Hello, everyone. What do I want to talk about today? I didn't put a video up over the fourth weekend due to all the firecrackers and whatnot being fired. Some of them sound like shotgun shells and 22s, but that's just probably something wrong with my ears. Written, published in 1959. So it was probably written 57, 58. I had to read it in high school. And from time to time, I get it out and read it or parts of it. I do not own the copyright. This is simply an editorial on the banking system. In the event, in a event. So this actually, it's another one of the books that I used to go to Orange County, Jacksonville, Florida, see my cousins, usually twice a year. So a lot of these places I know really has changed since I was there in the 60s. But I'm going to jump in. If you have the 1983 paperback edition, it's on page 112. And this is about a banker. And no, this is not the story of It's a Wonderful Life. Our favorite angel, Clarence, and how he saved George Bailey. During the winter season, the First National Bank was open on Saturday mornings from 9 until noon, and Edgar saw no reason why a war should interfere with banking hours. Like almost everyone else, he was awakened by the rumble of the first distant explosions and felt a thrill of fear when the siren on the firehouse let loose. He urged his wife Henrietta to make breakfast at once while he tried to put through long-distance calls to Atlanta. When his phone made strange noises and the operator would not respond, he listened to the scanty 30-second local news broadcast. Hearing nothing that sounded immediately alarming for Fort Repose, which is actually a town that did exist. Randy Bragg's great uncle, I found in another book on history of the Civil War, actually was here during the 1840s and actually did build a fort. He reminded Henrietta that nothing drastic had occurred after Pearl Harbor. On the Monday after Pearl Harbor, there had been no runs, no bank panics. Nonetheless, he could not force himself to finish his bacon and eggs. He left for the bank 15 minutes earlier than usual. When he got to the bank, nothing was right. The phones weren't working there. And at 8:30, when his staff should have reported for work, half his people hadn't shown up. About the same time, he noticed a line of depositors forming at the front entrance, and it was this that made him decide to send a wire to Federal Reserve. He had never received any instructions on what to do in an emergency of this kind, and as a matter of fact, he had never even considered it. Western Union's failure to send his telegram worried Edgar somewhat, but he told himself that it was impossible that the enemy could have bombed all of these big cities at once. It was probably some sort of mechanical trouble that would be cleared up before long, just as repairmen would soon have Fort Repose phone system back in working order. When the bank's doors opened at 9, the people seemed orderly enough. It was true that everyone was withdrawing cash and nobody was making deposits. Edgar wasn't overly worried. There was almost of $250,000 cash on hand. I think the $1,000,000 cash. A far higher ratio of cash than regulations required, but consistent with his conservative principle. And those of you who heard my last video about Basel III, they don't even have to have a reserve in the bank anymore in the United States. 0. Just so that you know. In 10 minutes, Edgar's optimism dwindled. Mrs. Estes, his senior teller, turned over her cage to the bookkeeper and entered his office. Mr. Quisenberry, these are not ordinary withdrawals. These people are taking out everything. Savings accounts and all. Edgar snapped. No reason for that. They ought to know the bank is sound. May I suggest that we limit withdrawals, let them take out enough so that each family can buy what necessities are needed in the emergency, and that way we can stay open until noon and there won't be any panic. It'll protect the merchants too. Edgar was incensed by her effrontery, practically amounting to insubordination. When you are president of this bank, then it will be up to you to make such decisions. But let me tell you something, Mrs. Estes. The only way to stop a run on a bank is shovel out the cash. As soon as you do that, people will regain confidence and the run stops. Mr. Quisenberry, it's entirely different today. Don't you see that? You have to assume some sort of leadership or there's going to be a panic. Will you please return to your cage? I'll run the bank. This was Edgar's first and perhaps his vital error. The mailman came in and dropped a packet of letters on the secretarial desk. Edgar was heartened to see his mailman. The good old U.S. government still functioned, neither rain nor snow nor dark of night. Doesn't know my mailman. This is my last delivery. Planes and trains aren't running. The trucks didn't come in from Orlando this morning. This batch is from last night. We can accept outgoing mail, but we don't dare guarantee when it will go out or if it will ever go out. So to make a long story short, Edgar's cashier came into the office and said, "We're not cashing out-of-town checks, are we?" "Certainly not. How can we cash out-of-town checks when we don't know whether the town is still there?" Another cashier came in, a thin man with a vain nose and nervous stomach. A man given to fretting over detail clasped his hands tightly together as if to prevent his fingers from flying off into space. He asked another question. "What about traveler's checks? Do we cash those?" "No. Traveler's checks are usually redeemed in New York, and between you and me, I don't think there's much of New York left." Hope you're not watching the news. New York City is a perfect place for your summer vacation 2021. "No, sir." "What about government savings bonds?" "No, sir." "But they want to cash in their bonds." He hesitated. To refuse to cash government savings bond was fiduciary sacrilege, so awful that the possibility never before had entered his head. Yet here he was faced with, "No, we don't cash any bonds. Tell those individuals that we won't cash any bonds until we find out whether the government stands or if it's even still here. The news that the First National was refusing to honor travelers' checks and government bonds spread through Fort Repose tiny business sections in a few minutes. The merchants, grocers, druggists, proprietors of specialty shops and filling stations deduced that if travelers' checks and government bonds were worthless, then all checks would soon be worthless. Since opening their doors that morning, all sales records had been smashed. Everybody was buying everything, which to the shopkeepers was exhilarating as well as frightening. Most of them, from the first, had been cautious, refusing to accept out-of-town checks, except, of course, payroll, annuity, government pension checks, which everyone assumed were always as good as cash. When the bank acted, their first reaction was to regard all paper currency as probably worthless. Their next reaction was to race to the bank and attempt to convert their suddenly suspect paper assets into currency. This is the part that I want to get to. Should have highlighted it, but I hate to mark up my books. Let's see. He basically pulls all the cash register drawers, puts $145,000 in the vault, sets the timer to Monday. He'd made his decision. Everybody was murmuring. The temporary closing has been ordered by the government as an emergency measure. It was only a white lie, not that big of a lie. He was quite sure that had he been able to get in touch with the Federal Reserve, this of course would have been what they would have advised. I can assure you that your savings are safe. Remember, all deposits up to $10,000 are insured by the government. The bank is sound and will reopen as soon as the emergency is over. Thank you. And everybody was escorted out the door. He gave everybody who was an employee a week's salary and sent them home. And this is the part that I really wanted to talk about, since we all know what happened last year. Edgar's calculations were not correct. He had forgotten about the implacable law of scarcity. Like small towns, Fort Repose food and drug supply was dependent upon daily or 3 times a week deliveries from warehouses in the larger cities. Each day, tank trucks replenished its filling stations. For all other merchandise, it was dependent on shipments by mail, express, highway freight, jobbers, manufacturers elsewhere. When the red alert, all these services halted entirely and at once, like thousands of other towns and villages not directly seared by the war, Fort Repose became an island. From that moment, its inhabitants would have to subsist on whatever was already within its boundaries, plus what they might scrounge from the countryside. Provisions and supplies melted from the shelves. Gasoline drained steadily from the pumps. Closing of the First National Bank failed to inhibit the buying rush. Before closing, the bank had injected an extra $100,000 in the cash economy, and it was unevenly distributed, and strangers appeared eager to trade what was in their wallets for necessities of the moment and the future. The people of Fort Repose had no way of knowing it, but establishments on arterial highways, which I think there's still only 1 or 2 in Florida, one on the east, and oh, by the way, that condo that went down, now it's getting soaked with water, and the bodies are still there. Leading down both coasts and crisscrossing between large cities had swiftly been stripped of everything, From the time of the red alert, the highway had been jammed with carloads of refugees seeking asylum. They do not know where. The mushroom cloud over Miami emptied Hollywood and Fort Lauderdale. The tourists, I guess that's Hollywood, Florida. The tourists instinctively headed north on Route 1 and A1A as frightened birds. It would be a hedge to seek their nest. Sorry. Yeah, that was my warning. I got 5 minutes. The chaos did not result from a breakdown in civil defense. It was simply that civil defense as a realistic buffer against thermonuclear war did not exist. Here we go. In Florida alone, several 100,000 families were on the move, few with provisions more than one day, and some with nothing at all except a car and money. So a necessity, they were voracious, all-consuming armies of ants. The roadside shops, restaurants, filling stations, bars, juice stands along the 4-lane highways was denuded of stocks, or put out a sign claiming so. Only the souvenir shacks with their useless pink flamingos and tinted shells were not picked clean. This is why strangers swinging off these barren highways invaded Fort Repose and little towns on the main traffic stream. Those people in Fort Repose who remembered rationing in the Second World War also remembered what goods had been in short supply back in 1942 and 1943 and bought accordingly. They were runs on tires, coffee, sugar, cigarettes, butter, the choicer cuts of beef, and nylon stockings. Some proprietors, realizing that these items would vanish, instituted their own rationing system. And here's where I'm going to end with this last paragraph. It was crazy, January of 2020. The more thoughtful wives bought portable radios, extra batteries, candles, kerosene, lanterns, matches, lighter fluid, flints, first aid kits, and quantities of soap and toilet paper. Well, as we find out, you'll have to read it to find out about Edgar Quisenberry, the banker. Well, thank you all. If I don't talk to you all, I'm going to learn how to use my voice. I don't know if it's getting older or my voice is just getting gravelly. Hope you have a good day. History does not repeat itself. It simply rhymes. And who said that? Mark Twain.